Hey friends, welcome to the Determinetruth Podcast, where we equip the church to be the church. Hey everyone, welcome in. We are in a new series. These are always fun shows for me because I have ADD and starting new things are awesome. And so we're in the Pastoral Epistles, which if you've read your Bible, you're like, I don't know any book of the Bible called the Pastoral Epistles. What word are you saying, Vinnie? And so what does this even mean, Rob? Why would I call something a pastoral epistles? And what are we going to find in these things? Obviously something pastoral, right? But why would I even say a bad word like epistle?
I'm not going there. First and Second Timothy and Titus are grouped together as three letters that are thought to have been written by the Apostle Paul near the end of his ministry. So after all the journeys are basically over, and we call them the Pastoral Letters because now it appears that Paul's like handing the baton on to Timothy saying, hey, you and Titus, this is how you do things after I'm gone. I'll no longer be here to make the decisions. And so this is what requirements are for pastors, requirements are for elders, requirements are for deacons. Is there a difference between pastors and elders? So basically people go to 1st, 2nd Timothy and Titus for church government. This is how it's to be done. We're going to discuss that as we go. Some will go, okay, this is how services are to be done. And others, qualifications for elders and deacons. If you have anything like that, then you go to 1st, 2nd Timothy and Titus to say, this is how it's to be done, requirements for being a pastor, elders, deacons, etc. And obviously the women issue becomes a big part of the conversation.
So when we've just come off our last series on Thessalonians, we kind of made a big deal saying this isn't the place you should go to try to mine for eschatology. There are some end time stuff, but not in the way that we've historically been taught to look at in the West. With you making that comment about some mine about church government or look for qualifications for church leadership, the pastoral letters do address those topics, right? So this is different than for Thessalonians, where we're saying no, this is an appropriate way to or appropriate place to go to, but this probably isn't the only place you should go to. The pastorals are not a systematic theology.
That's the problem. And we're going to process this over the next several episodes. That it's like, do we take this as the word used earlier in our conversation was normative, as this is the way it's to be done in all churches at all times? Is this the way it's to be done in churches in North Korea in the 21st century? Or was Paul even capable of thinking of that? And was the only thing of his historical moment in the first century? So we're going to, that's one of the issues.
Okay. So we'll look through these three letters. We'll put them together. We're not going to go verse by verse, but we are going to look at some of the bigger themes that are happening here. And we're also going to try to bring on some guests, both scholars and practitioners to talk about this.
Yes, absolutely. Exactly. Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, we're not going to survey 1st, 2nd Timothy and Titus. We might survey 2nd Timothy because it's kind of a unique letter there. It might be interesting for our conversation, but we're just going to talk about some topics and things that arise in these letters. We'll frame the conversation today with what do we know about the letters? When were they written? Things like that. But ultimately, we're going to look at some different topics and different conversations.
Okay. So let's start with the first issue. And we normally do this when we launch into a new book, but authorship. And this actually becomes an issue for the pastorals. There's many scholars who say that no, Paul didn't actually write these letters. There's some there's letters that we would call undisputed, and then there's the disputed. So Romans, 1 Corinthians, Galatians. Most scholars, you're always going to find some scholars. So we're gonna leave the fringe people out. The overwhelming majority of scholars would all acknowledge there was a historical man named Paul, who is a first century Palestinian Jew who was a convert, became a follower of Jesus, and then went out and was doing, was teaching this Jesus message and wrote these letters and started these churches and traveled all throughout. That's the overwhelming majority of scholars.
Yeah, he's not a Palestinian Jew, by the way. He's from Tarsus.
Oh, okay. Oh, good to know. Good correction on my end.
Yeah.
And so, but people aren't going to, deny that.
Yeah.
There are some letters, though, in which scholars would say, we don't think he actually wrote this, Colossians or, the pastorals or something like that. So this becomes an issue.
It's a big issue for these letters because of the content of the letters. Excuse me, I'm choking on my own. Yeah.
On your own stuff. And the power of edit, this is in now forever. I mean, I guess I could go and edit, but I'm not going to take.
I'll be okay, Vinnie. Hold on. Okay. We had to make it dramatized for the video. Anyways, make it look good. Mm-hmm. We'll make a clip of that.
There you go.
Anyways, all right. So the pastoral letters have these controversial topics in it. They seem to be addressing later issues. They seem to have a theology that's addressing like false teaching, and the false teaching is kind of like, what is this teaching that sounds almost second century-ish? And as a result, people want to place these letters later, and then it becomes easier to say, therefore, I don't have to listen to what that letter says because Paul didn't write it. Now, one of the ideas behind it is if Paul didn't write these letters, then it's easier to say that they're wrong, or maybe they reflect ideas from the second century church or later first century church that aren't part of the early Christian church. So if you hold to a conservative view of inspiration, then they're Pauline, and because we have to, the Bible is the inspired word of God and it's trustworthy at all times. That's oftentimes, might have been oversimplifying there, how this debate kind of works. Like, do I want to accept this or reject this? Well, it's easier to reject it if it's not Pauline, kind of thing. Now, some will say, well, maybe, and typically, like, even with moderate, conservative, liberal, whatever that spectrum means.
And we don't mean political. We're not speaking political here. It's theological, conservative, theological, liberal.
Exactly, right. And theologically liberal would be, well, Paul may not have written it. It may or may not be correct or true at all times, depending on how far on the liberal side of the spectrum you go.
It's a spectrum.
Conservative would be, it's dogmatic. This is the way it is. True for everybody at all times. Inspired by God. Yeah, there's a human authorship, but really it's God actually dictating to the author. In the middle are going to be people who will say, well, maybe Paul didn't write it, but whoever did write it was a Pauline disciple. That's pretty common. It was either Paul or a disciple of Paul's. Now, here's what's interesting, because you said we usually start a conversation on the letters with this way. We haven't really addressed authorship on like almost anything of the books that we've ever done.
Have we not done
Even
that?
when we did Revelation, yeah. Even when we did Revelation, we didn't discuss the authorship. And that's very intentional on my part. I don't care. So here's the funny story. So I was the dean at a seminary you may remember, and Roberta Hestenes was our executive president there. And so I was writing a syllabus for a course on the Gospel of John. And so I had she was the only one above me at the institution. So she had to oversee my syllabus. So I present the syllabus for the Gospel of John course at a graduate school. And she says, well, there's nothing in here about authorship. And the Gospel of John, it's a huge question. Who's the author of the Gospel of John? Huge question. And I said, yeah. She goes, well, you have to talk about the authorship of the Gospel of John if you're going to talk about the Gospel of John. I said, listen. I said, here's my thought. I have 24 hours of lectures, 12 weeks, 2 hours a week. I said, I don't want to waste 1 or 2 of those hours discussing who the author may or may not be. I want to get into the text. The text is not going to change. Chapter 1 through 20, it's going to be the same. And I want to get into what is said, not who said it. And she goes, Rob, you're very pragmatic. I'm like, I think that's a compliment. But so when it comes to the book of Revelation, for example, it's like, look, the author says his name's John. The conservatives think I assume that means the Apostle John. Okay, cool. I don't have to. And the liberals think, well, it's John. He's not sent yet. It doesn't matter. The text is unchanging. With this one, it kind of matters a little bit more with 1st, 2nd Timothy and Titus, because it's one of those, is this a later accretion into the church that has more formality to it? I just think it's more relevant. But I think at the end of the day, well, we'll get into it a little bit more as we go here. I think we're probably left with something that it's Pauline into some nature, if not Paul himself.
Okay. And even if it's, how do I even ask this question? Let me back up. We look at something like Isaiah, which you have the first 39 chapters, and then you have 40 through 66, and that's another
40 through 55 and 56 through 66.
So, that's the thing. Is there 2 Isaiah? Is there 1 Isaiah? Is there 2 Isaiahs? Is there 3 Isaiahs? And that's something where most people, especially in the evangelical world, have never even studied that topic.
They've never heard of that.
No, and that's something where like all scholars will say like, hey, this book is clearly broken up into a couple chunks. At least two. And I remember struggling this in seminary, and it was actually a classmate who was totally fine with this conversation, and she was probably more to the left than I was.
Sure.
But she had made some sort of comment like, I don't care if there's one Isaiah, like real Isaiah who wrote this, or 2 Isaiahs or 3 Isaiahs. the same Spirit of God who inspired them or empowered them to write is the one who is speaking here. And so that's what I'm working with. I don't care who wrote the words. It's the words that matter. And so she says something to the effect, and I'm like, okay, that helps me at least move through the conversation at least.
Yeah. I think totally fair.
Yeah. So
just for the listener's sake, by the way, first 39 chapters of Isaiah are clearly like 100 years before the last 27 chapters of the book of Isaiah. There's almost no way it's the same author.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, and the question in scholarship is there 2 or 3 authors, and it was stitched together. That's just, they did that in the ancient world very commonly.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's just not an issue.
Yeah, and like on the Gospel of John, you clearly see that, especially in the prologue and the epilogue, where it's like this just seems like a different book altogether. And I mean, it's obviously it wasn't John writing at the end because someone was talking about John and who he was, and it seemed to be someone else. But anyway, that's a whole other.
Well, that's certainly the case with Deuteronomy and Moses' death.
Exactly. There's multiple places in the Bible where we see that sort of thing happen. So even if you look at Romans, like it tells us there's multiple people involved in the writing of that. It's not just Paul.
Well, Tertius is the scribe.
Tertius, yes, but isn't it also like me and Tim? He says it's from him and Timothy, right?
In Romans,
I think it's in Romans.
Look that up.
I'll go back
obviously, he says many of the letters are written by Paul. And somebody else as well. Romans is just Paul.
Okay. I'm thinking there's another one that I'm going through.
There's a lot of them. Yeah. Where it's Paul and Silas and Timothy, or Paul and Timothy.
Exactly.
Colossians is Paul and Timothy, for example.
Okay. So, let's, one of the reasons why there is pushback in terms of Pauline authorship going back to the pastorals is the vocabulary and the style of writing are a little different than his normal, the undisputed letters that we would say. But I mean, there's reasons why that, in my end, that's never been something that has been a good argument for why to reject it. I mean, you could have different scribes writing. Just the fact that I speak differently, even working on a church staff, I speak differently in terms of how I speak about scripture and exhort to someone in my class than I would my fellow servant at a pastoral level, right? You're just going to talk differently. And the same thing might be happening here.
And what we're asking the question is who's the author? Because the question of authenticity is just, all right. So 1/3 of the vocabulary in the pastoral letters, and again, pastoral letters are 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus. Remember, by the way, the letters of Paul were grouped together by letters to churches and then by size. So Romans through Thessalonians, letters to churches and then by size. Romans is the biggest. 1 Corinthians is the next biggest. 2 Corinthians is attached to 1st. That makes sense. And then 1st, 2nd Thessalonians are attached together. Then you have letters to people. So Timothy, Titus, and Philemon, putting 2 Timothy with 1 Timothy. So they're also by size. Obviously, Philemon is the smallest. But these 3 letters, not including Philemon then, are what we call the pastoral letters. And they have like 1/3 of the vocabulary are simply not found in the letters that we know are Paul's. There's no question about that.
Can we stop right there real quick? Because if I've read the Bible my whole life, and as Protestants, we're very familiar with with Paul's writings. I read Paul and I'm like, this sounds like everything else Paul says. What we mean by that is saying the Greek letters, the Greek words themselves are, while they might be translated in a very smooth, readable way, it's the Greek word itself is only used there. What's it called? Hapex legomenon.
That would be a word that occurs only one time.
And we see a lot of that happening in Paul's letters here, where he might use the similar words or similar vocabulary in his other writings. It's only found once here. And that's what you mean by that, right?
Yeah. But the reality of that is we know he has scribes. We know Tertius wrote the book of Romans. He even said, I, Tertius, send my, it's like, wait a minute, are you allowed to do that? This is like inspired by God. What are you doing, buddy? Is God speaking to you? Come on. So that verse is like not inspired. Anyways, all right. Then you have different scribes. 1st and 2nd Peter, by the way, are very much an interesting conversation because the style of Greek is radically different. In one, it's Paulist Greek, and in the other one, it's like the guy has a grade school education. And so it's like, well, maybe one's is Peter himself, and maybe one's a scribe who's polishing it because Peter didn't have the greatest of educations. So that could be part of it, the scribe. It could be the topics as well. As soon as you're doing like a statistical analysis, like Paul uses this word only in these 3 letters, well, it's because he's talking about pastors and deacons and elders and church government, and he's not doing that in Ephesians and other letters. So the biggest issue, though, is that these letters ultimately are just too small. You can put all this stuff in computers today. We have AI now, right? And you can put all that in computers and say, hey, were these books written by the same individual? And there are stylistic ways of doing that. And the computers are just going to spit back and go, we don't have enough data to come to a conclusion. There's just not enough information. By the way, this is an issue with 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John. Were they written by the Apostle John? Well, it's sure, by the same as the author of the Gospel of John. Sure sounds like it. I mean, they're epistles of love. He talks about love all the time. The Gospel of John, it just sounds like it. And so even the word overcome in Revelation sounds like overcome in 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John. But it's just too hard because the books aren't big enough to do that with. So at the end of the day, it seems to be not definitive either way, and I think it seems most likely that we're just going to land on these are written by Paul. It seems to be such. I think I was listening to N.T. Wright, by the way, this weekend. He had an episode on his Ask N.T. Wright Anything podcast there. Not that we're endorsing it, just kidding. And one of the questions was the pastorals written by Paul or whatever? And he seemed to land on, yeah, that's the best we can do is to say, yeah, this is written by, they were written by Paul. The biggest argument against is that fact that some of the terminology in these letters actually reflects 2nd century Greek writings. That suggests it's later, and that's legit.
So let's talk about that. So one of the issues that you do see, not issues, but one of the topics that you see in the pastorals is that you have a very developed church hierarchy. And so you have bishops, elders, deacons, and these words that appears, more structured than you would, like you said, later in the 2nd century than you would see in the 1st century, right? And so this is why one of the reasons why people will critique this, saying, no, this is sounding like a later document.
Yeah, and it is, and that's all we can say. It is. Now, is it because Paul is near the end of his life, wants to pass the baton on to Timothy and to Titus and say, hey guys, here's how we're going to do it from here on out? Or is that something that doesn't arise for 30, 40, or 50 more years? And these letters should be dated late 1st century. Well, it is what it is. And at the end of the day, these are in the scriptures and we're going with it. And why are we debating this all day long? Okay, are we, right? I'm not saying that to you. I'm just saying that in general, why do we have these conversations?
Well, I mean, it is a big deal in a sense, and it can be for some people, especially if you've been taught.
Exactly.
Like we use the term spectrum, right? So there's a spectrum of belief between liberal and conservative theologically.
I'm on the spectrum.
Many of us are.
Oh, that's another issue.
That's a different spectrum. Yes,
I digress.
But there's a theological spectrum that has nothing to do with politics, and usually to do a caricature of it, the more you are on the left side of the spectrum, the more likely you're to say, the more likely you're to remove a supernatural element of the text. And so there's atheists who are biblical scholars who they don't believe a God exists. They certainly wouldn't affirm then that there's any God involved in the text itself. And in the most extreme circumstances on this spectrum, that person would say, what we find in the scriptures is merely what the people thought their God was asking them to do, or they were recording something in that. And I'm giving a character, like an easy low shelf version of this. On the far right side of the spectrum, you're going to find a view that would say, a more conservative view is going to say, like, no, every word that's in the scripture, it's almost like an Islamic view of the scriptures that said God dictated this, or maybe one of my profs would make, not you, a different one, not as interesting as you, prof, but
not as good as I,
definitely not as good.
One of the lesser prof,
the lesser Rob, anyway.
Well, we won't even call him Rob.
No,
not worthy.
We'll call him Bob. So Professor Bob, he would make the comment, like kind of a joke, saying, "There's
different, Vinnie."
Right? There's some people
who go like Jeff.
Jeff with a G, the dumb way.
Oh yeah, like who spells? Come on, people.
It's a very good SNL skit. Not that I would ever watch that because it's heathen.
I haven't seen it. Yeah, because we're Christians.
Anyway, we can't edit anymore, Rob. We have to stay on topic. ADD is strong in this one today.
Oh my God, hold on. Stop. Dang
it. Did you hurt yourself laughing again?
I did. Oh.
This happened before, and we edited part of it, but now we're going to see this in all its glory. Okay. Rob having an injury, work-related injury. Here, I'm keep going. There's on the conservative side, my prof would make kind of the joke that there's some people who would believe that they have this sort of belief that like Paul would sit down at a desk and then God would kind of zap him and take over him. His eyes would roll in the back of his head, and he would just be writing mindlessly, not even knowing what he's writing. And that's kind of like an extreme conservative view. There's a spectrum. There's a whole lot of beliefs all over this place on where Christians land. We would obviously say, if you're an atheist on the left, you're not a Christian. That's not a Christian view. But that view of kind of God possessing you and taking over and kind of forcing this dictation, I don't think that's a good Christian view either, because that's just ignoring so much.
The human element of the scriptures,
which clearly exists there. I mean, Paul, like how many times I'm writing to you, and he's making these personal type of comments that are happening in there. There's got to be some fluidity and flexibility in terms of how we view these documents. But at the end of the day, on our side of the equation, we would affirm that like God is involved in this in some way.
Yeah, and for years I actually held the idea that this is divinely inspired without the human author, but then. And you have that passage in Timothy where, in Peter, they were carried along by the Holy Spirit. Okay. But then we begin to realize actually that God's way of operating, and this is so important for us as Christians, his way of operating is to use us, his people, right? The whole Paul on the road to Damascus experience. Paul was not converted on the road to Damascus. He was blinded on the road to Damascus. And for 3 days he was blinded until Ananias laid hands on Paul. So God uses his people. So we realize, with the scriptures itself, there's this human element behind it. And we can go too far on either side with that. But what convinced me of that was the fact that 1st and 2nd Peter, the style is so radically different. Like, well, if this is just dictated by God, then you wouldn't have that massive stylistic differences there. But at the end of the day, Vinnie, whether it's the conservative or the liberal, what we're going to debate is the text. The conservative is going to say, well, Paul says women can't be in ministry, but we know women can be in ministry. That's the liberal. And the women can be in ministry. Therefore, Paul was wrong. I'm like, I don't think Paul's saying that. Let's look at or whoever the author is. Let's see what the text says. The conservative is going to say, but dogmatically, if you've been divorced, you can never be a pastor because that's what it says and it's dictated by God. It's like, but is that what the text says? It says, they must have the husband but one wife. Mm-hmm. Oh, does that exclude women? And does that mean that if you've ever been divorced, you can't be it's a question of exegesis. It's not a question of how it was inspired or dictated. So let's go to the text. And therefore, the author becomes important, but ultimately somewhat secondary. I think it's like, we're going to look at 2 Timothy. I think it's interesting, if not helpful, to understand that this is Paul to a close accomplice of his named Timothy, who was a younger man, almost father-son relationship, at the end of his life, writing almost his last will, saying, hey, Timothy, get here before I die. I think that just adds so much to understanding of the letter, this emotional part of the letter. But other than that, let's look at 1 Timothy 2 and see what it says about women. Let's look at 1 Timothy 3 and see what it says about elders and deacons and pastors and bishops. And the authorship question kind of goes out the door.
At Determined Truth, we do more than just this podcast. One of our major projects is training pastors in India each week. We even help start a Bible college there. But we could only do this because of the generous support from partners like you. Seriously, that means you. If you'd consider supporting us with a fully tax-deductible donation with anything from $5 a month or more, we can continue to equip the church to be the church. To give, go to determinetruth.com and click on the Give tab, or find the link in today's show notes. Thanks. Let's keep asking a few overview questions as we just, get that 30,000 foot view.
Yeah, good.
The pastorals really treat faith and the truth as a more established thing. You have this body of teaching or doctrine that's to be preserved and handed down. We see this in 1 Timothy 6 or 2 Timothy 1. So some people also, once again, say that, hey, this is a more developed stage or tradition than you would have seen in that first generation of disciples.
Yeah, let's go ahead and look at 1 Timothy 6, if we can. 1 Timothy 6, verse 20. Let's see. I'll read that one, and if you want to read the other reference, or how's that?
Sure.
1 Timothy 6, verse 20, and it says, "O Timothy, guard what has been entrusted to you, avoiding worldly and empty chatter and the opposing arguments of what is falsely called knowledge." And you're going to see this in 2 Timothy as well. Guard the good deposit. Timothy, guard what's been entrusted to you, because people are trying to go astray with it. All right.
Yeah.
And then the other reference was 2 Timothy chapter 1, verses 13 and 14, which is this, I just referenced it. Yeah.
Hold to the standard of sound teaching that you have heard from me in the faith and love that are in Christ Jesus. Guard the good treasure entrusted to you with the help of the Holy Spirit living in us.
Yeah. And this is very much like this, an Orthodox understanding at times. I think they would use these letters to say there's a tradition that was handed down from the apostles.
When you say Orthodox, do you mean like the Orthodox Church or just orthodoxy?
No, the Orthodox Church.
Okay.
Like Orthodox, I mean orthodoxy, like Catholic, Protestant, Orthodox.
Church. Okay.
I mean Orthodox in that sense.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So
they would use this as an apologetic, if you will, for why they would have retained
those traditions that we must adhere to.
Okay.
Exactly.
Is that something where, I mean, as someone who has been in the Baptist tradition for a long time, we obviously don't have a line of succession, or there is that severance of tradition. And oftentimes with Baptists, you find an anti-Catholic bigotry because you see this appeal towards tradition in the Roman Catholic Church. And this is where I would say, like, as a Baptist, I would look at this text and saying, yeah, there's not a pouring out of the tradition in that kind of way in terms of a succession that I might have had in the Lutheran Church when I grew up as a Lutheran. I don't have that in the Baptist Church, but there is an adherence to the traditions of the church. There's a formal belief system that we have in terms of the Apostle Creed or the Nicene Creed. Is that something that we would look into when we look at what is the church in our conversation, to say that, hey, are they meaning something like literally a passing of the baton, literally in terms of a line of succession? Or are we talking about just the things that we would believe that could be trans-denominational, if you will?
Okay. So this is where, if we were not on video, we would edit, because I would be going, okay, so I'm totally ADD on this one. I missed like almost the first half of what you just said. So we can't do that. So we're going to just pretend.
Okay.
That I was listening.
Okay.
I think I follow. So I started tracking the second half of your question, but the first half I lost. And so tell me if I'm right. There's a tendency in Orthodoxy, and I can't speak for Catholicism here, but I would suppose that says whatever was established in the first century church in terms of the way it's to be done, the way things are to be done, whatever that might mean, sermons, communion, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, we are to maintain over the course of time. Right. And I would add the question of like, but what happens when culture and society changes? What do we do with that? And one of the issues that I personally have with Orthodoxy is, how would a person in the West, how could you evangelize them into Orthodoxy? Because it's such an Eastern way of doing things. And there's an appeal for some people to that. And there's an appeal, like a non-appeal for others with that. All right. Am I on the right track though with your question?
It could be. Yeah. Keep going with it. We'll see.
I don't know. You weren't listening to what I
wasn't paying attention. It was my ADD. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Okay. And thanks for the show. Oh, no, it's been 45 minutes, Vinnie.
No, it hasn't. It's been 30, but go ahead.
Okay. Anyways, go ahead. We're good. Yeah. So does that help? Yeah.
Well, but
when it comes to sound doctrine, by the way, the liberals are going to say that the New Testament doesn't agree on what the sound doctrines are. Therefore, we don't have to worry about holding to them too tenaciously. I think you and I are going to be very uncomfortable with that.
Mm-hmm.
The conservatives are going to be, no, we have to be zealous for the truth and sound doctrine. And we're going to talk about this, I think, on our next episode. And I think we both are going to go, there's a danger here because you defined what sound doctrine is. And your definition of sound doctrine is something that many Christians just don't even agree with.
Mm-hmm.
You've almost eliminated them from the church. Be careful there. And we have to be careful about the dogmatism that can arise from 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus.
Which is interesting because every Christian denomination, regardless of, once again, where they're at on that theological spectrum of conservative to liberal, every one of them is going to hold to what they believe is sound doctrine. And it could be something on a hyper conservative perspective of saying King James version only. On the left, they would have their own sound doctrine in terms of like what it looks to love your neighbor. And it might not be a theological doctrine in terms of academic, but it's going to be a doctrine of love and what that looks like and that sort of thing. So everyone has a doctrine that they would say this is sound doctrine.
Yeah, exactly. And dogmatically hold to it.
Yes, exactly.
Sometimes more than others.
Yes, absolutely.
All right.
The first century church, you mentioned that in relation to the Greek Orthodox Church, if we could call it that, for simplicity's sake.
That's fine.
We need to be careful when we say, "Oh, we're a first century church," because no one could be a first century church in so many ways. First off, if you're a first century church, you wouldn't even hold to the Nicene Creed, because that's something that was developed later in terms of the systematic formulation of how we think about something as important as the Trinity, which I'm very Trinitarian. But there's so much the fact that you probably drove to a facility means you're not a first century church. The fact that your facility has a 501c3, and if you live in America, you're not in danger of being persecuted. Although free speech is an interesting thing right now.
Maybe so. We just did a live stream on that last week, Vinnie.
Yeah. So, anyway, but what should we even use that phrase, first century Christianity or first century church? What do we mean by that?
Well, when we talk about the church in the first century, how's that?
Okay.
The first thing that happens when we go to the Pastoral Letters is we kind of assume that whatever was happening then is somewhat similar to what's happening now. But they didn't even have buildings back then. Well, they had church buildings, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
We know that church buildings began to arise after the rise of Constantinian Christianity, where Constantine, begins to bring money into the church. There's, as far as I'm aware, and I've been to Greece, and I remember we discussed this with Peter Walker on the trip, that there are no buildings, archaeological discoveries of buildings that would represent a Christian church prior to the 4th century. That means they're all house churches. Now, there might have been wealthy homes. Lydia, of course, for example, had enough in Philippi, had a large enough home for Paul and his companions to all stay in. And so maybe you have some wealthy individuals that have homes that are large enough. That may have been the issue in Corinth, by the way, that the wealthy people were eating over in the atrium in the formal dining area, and then the poor were eating over there, and but they're house churches. And so the church when we talk about the church in Rome, the book of Romans, it might have been written to 30 people, but we immediately think, oh, it's like 200 people congregation. And then you have other places where maybe there are 4 or 5 churches in that city. And they're all still relatively small, 20 people or more. Again, how many people can fit into a house is kind of the idea. So
I think
be
in Doug Moo's commentary on Romans, I remember him saying that each congregation was probably around 30 to 40 people, and there was probably 4 to 8 of those around Rome. And so you just have these small house churches in that region.
Yeah, fair enough.
Yeah. For going back to the pastorals, when do we think they were written? And this obviously depends on authorship. But I don't know, how would we address that issue?
So one of the issues that happens in 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus is typically thought that Paul wrote these later for the reason of the fact that Paul makes some geographical statements in these letters that don't correspond with anything in the book of Acts. So let's look at a couple verses here. I got them up on the screen. Let's start with, you want to read 1 Timothy chapter 1, verse 3?
Sure. So I urge you, as I did when I was on my way to Macedonia, to remain in Ephesus, so that you may instruct certain people not to teach any different doctrine.
So Paul's on his way to Macedonia. We're going to look at a map in just a moment. Macedonia is the northern part of Greece. And Timothy's going to stay in Ephesus. That's modern-day Turkey. That's the west coast of modern-day Turkey. We'll look at a map in just a minute. Let's go to the book of Titus now, Titus chapter 1, and I'll go ahead and read verse 5. For this reason I left you in Crete, that you had set in order what remains. All right. So all of a sudden now Paul's talking to Titus, and Titus is in Crete, and Paul is somewhere else. We have, again, from the book of Acts, we have no indication where Timothy stayed in Ephesus and Paul went to Macedonia. In Acts, Paul and Timothy both go to Macedonia together. Now we have a situation where Titus is in Crete and Paul's somewhere else. Like, well, what's that somewhere else? And I think the next verse is going to be in chapter 3. If you want to read chapter 3 of the book of Titus, verse 12.
Yeah. When I send Artemis to you, or Tychicus, do your best. Tychicus. Do your best to come to me at Nicopolis. Nicopolis?
Yeah, Nicopolis.
Nicopolis. For I have decided to spend the winter there.
Okay. So what we have in these statements here then is Paul giving some indications of where he is and where he's going, but they don't seem to correspond to anything in in the book of Acts. Here, I'm sure I'm going between screens and kind of muddling myself as well, and I just kind of made a mistake there. So here we go.
This is why we can't have nice things, Rob.
We can't. I know. All right, here we go. Share screen. And I'm going to bring up my atlas. There we go. So here we go. We've got...
And this is actually a good time because I don't think we've used an atlas before on the show when we've talked about this.
Okay.
Most people have these in their back of their Bible, right? So
like especially this particular map is often in the back of the NIV Bible.
Yeah. So maybe explain like what is the best way to use a map or an atlas if they have one even in their own Bibles right now?
I'm not sure what you mean by...
Well, for something like this, as you're studying any of Paul's journeys, you could usually find a map that will say something like, one of
this
Paul's
one's Paul's journey to Rome.
Okay.
And actually, it even tells you Acts 27 through 28.
Okay.
So you can kind of follow. And I'm just bringing it up because it has a larger map of kind of the Mediterranean world that Paul traveled. Yeah. So you have here, Macedonia right here. You can see my cursor. Is that right, Vinnie? Yeah. Macedonia there. Achaia down here, which this is modern day Greece. I think this is like New Macedonia, actually a country now there as well. Obviously Italy, and there's Rome over here to the west. Spain goes even farther west. Modern day Turkey over here. And notice that this is the province of Asia. So we've talked about that before. When Paul refers to Asia, or John writes to the 7 churches of Asia, Asia is not the continent. It's this region on the western coast of modern day Turkey. This is the region of called Asia Minor at the time of the biblical world. Bithynia and Pontus, that'll be relevant when we get to 1st and 2nd Peter. Galatia, of course, the book of Galatians. Cappadocia, Cilicia, where Tarsus is located, where Paul's from. And then you have Syria down here on the west coast, Cyprus, and then here's the island of Crete. So Paul indicates that he left Titus on the island of Crete. We don't know where he is. Okay. Paul also indicates that he's up here in Macedonia, and he left Timothy over here in Ephesus. Now, what the idea then is, among scholarship is, generally speaking, those who think it's Pauline would say that after Paul went to Rome in the book of Acts, and the book of Acts ends with Paul in a prison in Rome, he was likely released from that imprisonment. And he tells us in the book of Romans that he plans to go to Spain after he gets done from Rome. Now, he writes Romans from Corinth. So he's over here in Corinth. He writes the book of Romans, but what ends up happening is he says, hey, I'm going to come by and visit you on my way to Spain. It's a nice way of saying, I'm going to Spain and I'm going to drop by, when he really wants to go to Rome, right? I'm not inviting myself to your house, but I'm going to be traveling by. Can I come over? Because his plan is actually to come over. But what happens, though, is Paul leaves Corinth and actually goes down to Jerusalem and gets arrested in Jerusalem. This is in the book of Acts, chapter 21 and following. And then he ends up spending a couple of years on this particular red line here on this particular map, where he ends up journeying his way to Rome. And then he spends 2 years imprisoned in Rome. And that's where the book of Acts ends. Well, it seems to be that Paul was released from that imprisonment. And if that's the case, then he must have went on to Spain, even though Luke doesn't tell us anything about that in the book of Acts, because the book of Acts ends. So what many have suggested is that the chronology and the geography that Paul tells us here in Timothy and in Titus happens on this 4th journey, meaning the journey not recorded in the book of Acts.
But this does correspond with the book of Romans, where he says at the end of Romans, hey, I'm writing to you ahead of time because I want to visit you on my way to Spain. So we know that this is something he wanted to do, and that was written, Romans was written near the end of his ministry.
No, Romans was written, if there's a 4th journey, Romans would be written in the middle of his journey.
Yeah.
Romans was written at the end of his 3rd journey before he travels to Jerusalem. If he dies in Rome, then we're done. But if he doesn't die in Rome then, and he has a 4th journey, then we can put Paul leaving Titus on Crete. We can leave Paul leaving Timothy in Ephesus. Paul going over to Nicopolis. Nicopolis is not on this map. I didn't even realize it when I didn't bring it up. It's on the west coast of Greece. Okay, so that's kind of how do we fit the chronology here? Oh, we put this in later. I'm going to stop sharing the map here now. All right, here we go. And I've got to find our screen. So I have gone to Greece with Peter Walker, who's a biblical scholar, a wonderful New Testament scholar. And he's like, Rob, I got to show you this. As we walk through the land, let me kind of share with you what my thesis is in terms of what I think is actually going on. And what Peter does is he suggests that actually he thinks Paul died actually in Rome on that journey that's recorded in the book of Acts. He dies from that. And what he actually does is he traces Paul's letters and says he thinks that although Acts doesn't mention Paul going to the West Coast, that Paul did go to the West Coast and went to Nicopolis, stayed the winter there, and then travel later on down to Corinth. And so he places these letters actually earlier, which is, again, the whole idea of maybe Pauline, maybe not Pauline, is that these letters were written later because they have details that seem to fit a later church of hierarchy and structure and things of that nature. So he puts these letters a little bit earlier and kind of fits Paul going off of the West Coast then. But that's kind of the issue then. When were they written? Well, likely between 55, if you go with Peter Walker's thesis, or you go 63, 64, 65 AD. I think Paul was definitely killed by 65 AD. So if that makes sense.
Okay. Now, this assumes a Pauline or a disciple of Pauline authorship. For more of a critical scholarship that would just flat out deny it's Paul and says, hey, this reflects second century ideals. That's putting it into the 100s. Do you have an idea
or late first century for sure?
Okay, so a critical scholarship would have it in the late first century or early second century. Is that the way they would put it?
I would have to actually think if they would even go. There's somebody would probably go second century, but I'm not sure that would be. I think would be late first century would be more popular.
That's interesting. So even amongst critical scholars who maybe reject a Pauline authorship, they're not saying this comes centuries later in the 300s or 400s. They're just saying it's just later than Paul. It's not, but
it's a generation or more later.
Okay, but not hundreds and hundreds of years.
Correct.
Okay, that's actually interesting because I haven't studied that topic, and I wasn't sure where they placed it. If they placed it in a 200s or 300s or something like that.
No, I don't think anyone would even begin, because you have lists of the New Testament books written by 170s or whatever, and so it has to have been written before that for sure.
And what you're saying is the pastorals are included in those lists.
It's included in some of those lists as like. Well, not legit, but maybe legit. You know, they have different.
But they exist, though, at least. But they're acknowledging
lists,
it. Okay. Cool.
I'd have to think if it's in the Moratorian canon, which I think it's one of the first lists. I suspect that it is.
Okay.
And great. I think that Moratorian canon is 170, something like that, off the top of my head. But I don't think anyone's going to go anywhere near that late.
Okay. As we wrap up our intro today, which we haven't done a lot of application or anything. Yeah. It's been a lot of just getting a bearing of what are we studying here, what these books are. I don't know, do we want to start the conversation that we'll definitely dive into? I think we're going to have a couple of episodes that are highly practical and getting into application and that sort of thing. We're not going to be overly academic on everything, but do we want to start the question on just looking at the questions of why do we even go to church, or what does that look like, or I don't know, how are we bridging this conversation to us today in terms of looking at the overview?
Let's do that in the next episode. Yeah. So what we want to ask and process is, what is church? Why do we do church the way we do church? And what should church look like based on these letters? And we just want to process a lot of that. We're going to bring some other people and have this conversation with us. I think it'll be an interesting conversation. So we'll do that in the next episode.
Okay.
Or next few episodes as we get them scheduled.
Okay. How could someone prepare if they're following along and they're using this almost as a Bible study? Is it just a matter of reading through the epistles or the pastoral epistles?
Yeah, I think that would be the best thing. Read through 1st, 2nd Timothy, and Titus. And here's one of the things that we want to do, and that is we may even plan an episode at the end of this series where we kind of look at questions that have come up. So as you read through the text, read through 1st, 2nd Timothy, and Titus. And if you have any questions, throw them out to us and message us, whether it's on Determinetruth.com through the contact page, or whether they can message us on YouTube, right, Vinnie?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, okay. And message us, leave comments there. And then we'll see if we can process those comments and maybe have an episode if we haven't already addressed them. And then as well as we raise questions and have conversations, because we're going to have some conversations that are going to have like not even a formal script where we're kind of walking down through our notes here. We're just going to be talking back and forth. If that raises questions for you, and I suspect that it might, then ask those questions for us as well. But yeah, I would say just read through the text as much as possible and find some texts, some passages to resonate with and really meditate on. 2 Timothy 4 is great. I fought the good fight. I finished the race. I kept the faith. That's a cool little passage to kind of meditate on.
How would we encourage folks to read through the passages with fresh eyes? Because sometimes these are going to be passages that we're familiar with. And what we don't want to do is just say, okay, read it with the understanding that you already carry into the pre-understandings that you have, those presuppositions. What's a good way to go into it because remember, we're not just trying to teach someone to say, we want to have our own agenda in what we're doing here. We're saying, no, we're really trying to figure out, what did Paul mean when these words were written?
Yeah.
So
how do you understand it well? So how can you study it for yourself?
Yeah. So what are ways that you could just mentally prepare yourself before you even read the text to go in to get rid of those presuppositions and really try to have fresh eyes on a text?
Well, I get a Greek New Testament and read it in Greek. Okay. I would say read it in different translations, though.
Okay.
Open the message. I think the message is fantastic. I think it really is a good it's not a translation per se, as much as it is a really good application of what Paul said, or whoever the author said, in today's language. So the New Living Translation will do that as well. I'm not the biggest fan of like the Living Bible, but that's like an older version of those. I think the New Living Translation or the Message are great. And then just read it in some different translations and then have conversations.
Yeah. And ask questions. Even if you have a fully formed perspective on what you think these passages mean, go in and ask questions where, this is the way I've always taught it to me. Is this what it means? And you might come away saying, yes, that reaffirms what I've always thought, or, oh, there's a different perspective out there.
Yeah. And if you read it a second time and a third time over the course of this particular series, then start highlighting and underlining words that you see recurring. Oh, that word recurs. Oh, that word recurs. That word recurs. Oh, that's interesting. We'll talk about how God, our Savior, and the word Savior occurs in the book of Titus. It's kind of interesting what Paul does with it. It's clearly, or the author does with it. Really, I'm just going to say Paul. Really does. It's really intentional. It's kind of cool.
I'm trying to remember of when we had Sandra Glahn on. Lawn. She said it's like lawn. Okay, so because did she address that in our conversation? I'm trying to remember when we talked to her before the show or during the show, or if I read it in her book, because she makes a comment about that, how Artemis was the savior of Ephesus, and so that's one of the things that's one of the reasons why Paul was using that term when he was engaging in those regions, because of using a term that would have been popular for people who knew of Artemis. I don't know, I'm just thinking back on that to jog the memory as we study for this text again.
And you're asking someone with ADD to remember a conversation that happened when?
What was that?
Yeah,
so I was checking my Facebook page right now.
So full disclosure, Vinnie, you're doing the editing now that we're doing video.
Yes.
When I would do the editing, like 3 weeks ago when I was editing, I would listen to the episode and go, I had no idea we said that. So that was an episode that we just did earlier that morning. So now you want me to remember an episode that happened like 2 months? Yeah, not going to happen.
Just affirm, say, oh yeah, Vinnie, I remember when she said that. Good way to recall that.
Yeah, totally. She was, it's just like what you said.
Just exactly.
That's what she said. That's what she said.
Yeah. That's what she said.
All right.
I'm making a joke.
Thank you.
Anyway.
I know, and I'm not going down
You're not going down there? Okay, got it.
No.
All right, everyone. Well, hey, we're in the pastorals. Please, I didn't mention this ahead of time. Please like and subscribe to the new channel as we get things going on YouTube. This really helps in the algorithms. I didn't do this for years, and I try to do this to give back to those YouTubers that I appreciate. And so if you're finding this beneficial, please do that.
Give us the love.
Give us the love. And make some comments. We've been trying to engage with some of those. And we'll see you next time. So have a good week, everyone. See you guys later. Thanks for joining us today. If you dug it, please subscribe and share it with others. Check us out at Determinetruth.com to see more of what we do and maybe even consider supporting us. See you next time.
Faith is an ocean you can walk on.